Ambassador Varel of the Thesan Collective had lived for over 800 years, and in all that time he had never met a species quite like the humans. He stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station, watching through the massive windows as the human diplomatic fleet moved into position outside the station walls. And his four eyes blinked in slow confusion at what he saw there in the cold darkness of space. The human ships were not beautiful. Not in the way Thesan vessels were beautiful, with their flowing lines and silver hulls that caught starlight like jewels floating in the void. But there was something about these human vessels that made Viral feel strange inside his chest. Something that made his throat sacs pulse with an emotion he could not name. The ships were angular and harsh, covered in thick armor plating and weapon ports that the humans always claimed were purely defensive. And they moved through space with a purpose that seemed almost aggressive, even when they were doing nothing more than arriving for a peace conference. But what truly troubled Viral were the names painted on their hulls in bold, white letters that seemed to glow against the dark metal. HMS Leviathan, read the largest vessel, a dreadnought-class warship that dwarfed even the Thesan flagship. USS Kraken announced another ship as it glided past the observation window. INS Rakshasa declared a third vessel from the human nation called India. CNS Jiaolong proclaimed a fourth ship bearing the flag of China. Viral had been a diplomat for 300 years, and he had learned the languages and customs of over 200 species across the known galaxy. So he understood what these names meant even before his translation device whispered their meanings into his ear. Leviathan was a sea monster from ancient human mythology, a beast so vast it could swallow ships whole and drag sailors down into the crushing depths of their oceans. Kraken was another ocean nightmare, a creature with countless tentacles that could wrap around vessels and pull them beneath the waves, while the crew screamed for mercy that would never come. Rakshasa was a demon from human stories, a shape-shifting horror that fed on human flesh and terrorized villages in the dark of night. Jiaolong was a dragon of the waters, a serpentine monster that commanded storms and floods and brought destruction wherever it swam. Every single human vessel bore the name of something terrible, something that existed only to cause fear and death and suffering. And Viral could not understand why any species would choose such names for the ships that represented them among the stars. He turned to Commander Sarah Chun, the human liaison officer who had been assigned to help him during his stay on the station. And she was a small woman with dark hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets Viral could not read. "Commander Chun," Viral said, and his voice carried the musical tones that all Thesan voices carried. "I must ask you a question that has been troubling me since I first learned of your species and your ways." The human woman turned to face him, and she smiled in that way humans often smiled, with her lips curved upward and her teeth showing just slightly. And Viral had learned that this expression could mean warmth or welcome or sometimes warning depending on the situation. "Of course, Ambassador," she said, and her voice was calm and professional. "Ask me anything you wish to know." Viral gestured with one of his forearms toward the fleet outside the window, pointing at the names that glowed on those dark and angular hulls. "Why do your people name your vessels after creatures of terror and nightmare?" he asked, and genuine confusion filled his voice as he spoke. "The Thesan have sailed the stars for 12,000 years, and we name our ships after virtues and ideals that represent the best of what we wish to be. Names like serenity and accord and patience and wisdom. Names that speak of peace and understanding." He paused and gestured toward a Vethkai science vessel that floated near the human fleet, its hull marked with complex mathematical symbols. The Vethkai named their vessels after mathematical constants and scientific principles, he continued, because they value knowledge and precision above all other things. And their ship names reflect the order and logic they see in the universe. His four eyes turned back to Commander Chun, and he spread all four of his arms in a gesture of bewilderment. But humans choose names of monsters and demons and beasts that devour and destroy, he said. And I cannot understand what this says about your species, or what message you wish to send to the galaxy with such terrible names. Commander Chun was quiet for a long moment, and she turned to look out the window at the fleet she served, at the ships that bore those ancient and fearsome names. And something changed in her expression that Viral could not quite identify. It is an old tradition, she said finally, and her voice had grown softer and more thoughtful. Older than spaceflight, older than our wars, older perhaps than our civilization itself. She turned back to face Viral, and her dark eyes met his four alien eyes with an intensity that made him want to step backward, even though she had done nothing threatening. Long ago, when humans first built boats and sailed out onto the oceans of our world, they learned very quickly that the sea was dangerous, she explained. And our sailors believed that giving a ship a fearsome name would make the ocean think twice before trying to swallow it. That the waves and storms would see that name and hesitate before attacking. Viral's throat sacs pulsed with what might have been amusement, if he had been capable of finding humor in such primitive thinking. Superstition, he said, and he did not mean the word as an insult, but simply as an observation. Your people believed that names had power over nature. Commander Chum smiled again, but this time the smile was different. This time, it held something that looked almost sad, or perhaps knowing in a way Viral did not understand. The names were never meant to have power over nature, Ambassador, she said quietly. The names were never for us at all. She leaned closer to Viral, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The name is for whatever might be watching from the dark, she said. It is a warning to anything out there that might be thinking about hunting us. A message that says we know you are there and we are not afraid. Viral considered her words carefully, turning them over in his 800-year-old mind. And he found them interesting, but ultimately the product of a young and fearful species that had not yet learned the true nature of the universe. The Thesan had charted the galaxy for 12,000 years, and they had mapped every danger and cataloged every threat. And they knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing watching from the dark. Nothing hunting in the spaces between the stars. Nothing that required warning or challenge. The universe was vast and mostly empty, and the greatest dangers in it were the conflicts between civilized species. Conflicts that could be resolved through diplomacy and patience and understanding. He dismissed the human tradition as superstition, as a remnant of their species' violent and fear-soaked history on their small and dangerous world. And he felt a moment of pity for a people who still jumped at shadows after reaching the stars. He would remember this conversation for the rest of his very long life, and he would wish many times that he had listened more carefully to what Commander Chun was truly trying to tell him. But that knowledge would come later, in fire and darkness and screaming. And for now, Ambassador Viral simply nodded politely and turned back to watch the human fleet with its terrible names, floating peacefully in the void. The entity had no name in any known language, no designation in any database, no entry in any of the catalogs that the Thesan had compiled over 12,000 years of exploring the galaxy. It existed as something that should not exist, a living darkness that moved through the void between stars like a predator swimming through deep water. And it was old beyond any measurement that made sense. It was older than the Thesan collective. It was older than the stars it had consumed. It was older perhaps than the galaxy itself. A remnant of some previous universe that had somehow survived the birth of this one and had been sleeping in the cold darkness ever since, waiting for something to wake it from its ancient slumber. The convoy had woken it, and now it was hungry. Viral watched through the main viewport as the entity approached, and his mind struggled to process what his four eyes were showing him because nothing in his 800 years of life had prepared him for this moment. The thing had no solid form that he could identify, just a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to fold in on itself over and over again. Tentacles or limbs or something worse reaching out from its central mass and pulling it forward through space. It screamed as it came, not with sound, because sound could not travel through the vacuum, but with some kind of psychic emanation that hit Viral like a physical blow and made his throat sacs convulse with nausea. On the Vethkai science vessels, the telepaths were already dying, their minds shattered by the entity's broadcast hunger, their screams echoing through the communication channels before cutting off into terrible silence. All ships. The voice of Admiral Thizin came through the fleet communication system, and Viral could hear the fear beneath his commander's professional tone. Evasive maneuvers, pattern Delta 7. Maintain shield harmonics at maximum and prepare to retreat to safe distance. The Thyssen cruisers responded with the precision that had made them the peacekeepers of known space for thousands of years. Their beautiful silver hulls dancing through complex maneuvers while their shields shimmered with protective energy. It did not matter. The entity reached the cruiser named Serenity first, and Viral watched in horror as tendrils of impossible darkness simply passed through the ship's shields as if they did not exist. For one terrible moment, nothing happened, and Viral felt a spark of hope that perhaps the shields had worked after all. Then the Serenity simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris, no flash of light to mark the death of 400 decent crew members. The ship simply vanished as if it had never been there at all, consumed by the darkness in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Serenity is gone. Someone screamed over the communications channel. Serenity is just gone. The cruiser Accord tried to flee, its engines flaring with desperate power as it turned away from the entity and ran for open space. The darkness followed. Viral watched as the Accord gained speed, watched as the beautiful silver ship pushed its engines beyond their limits in a bid for survival, and for a moment it seemed like the ship might escape. Then the tendrils caught it. The final transmission from the Accord was a chorus of screams that Viral knew would haunt his dreams for however much longer he lived, which he suspected would not be very long at all. The Vethkai vessels tried to jump to faster-than-light speed, their advanced drives spinning up with a high-pitched whine that Viral could feel in his bones even through the hull of the Leviathan. The entity was faster. It swallowed both science vessels before they could complete their jump, and the burst of exotic particles that marked their deaths painted the darkness with colors that made Viral want to look away, but somehow could not. All around him, the human crew of the Leviathan worked at their stations with a calm efficiency that seemed insane given what was happening outside. Their hands moving across controls and their voices calling out reports in steady tones. Shield status, Captain Webb demanded, and his voice was still that steady rock that Viral had noticed when they first met. Shields are useless against that thing, sir, the tactical officer responded. Whatever it is, it does not interact with our defensive systems in any way we can measure. Weapon status. All batteries charged and ready, sir, but we have no idea if our weapons will have any effect. Viral turned to Captain Webb, and he felt his four hearts pounding so hard he thought they might burst from his chest. "You cannot fight that," he shouted, and his voice was high and desperate in a way that shamed him even as he spoke. "Nothing can fight that. We need to run. We need to flee. We need to get away from this thing before it destroys us all." Captain Webb did not look at Viral, did not take his eyes from the viewport where the entity was finishing the destruction of the last Thyssen cruiser. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried across the entire bridge. "We are not running, Ambassador," he said. "The Leviathan does not run. Then we will die." Viral screamed. "We will all die. Do you not understand that?" Webb finally turned to face him, and Viral saw something in those human eyes that he had never understood until that moment. something that made him step backward, even though the captain had not moved toward him. It was not courage, though courage was certainly there. It was not madness, though perhaps madness played a part. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who had always known this moment would come, who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of darkness, who had been waiting for something worthy of the monster whose name his ship bore. "Ambassador," Captain Webb said softly, and his voice was almost gentle despite the death that surrounded them. "Why do you think we name our ships after monsters?" Viral had no answer, could not speak, could not do anything but watch as Captain Webb turned back to his crew and began to give orders. "All hands," Webb announced, and his voice carried through every speaker on the ship. "Battle stations, we are weapons-free. This is not a drill." The Leviathan began to move, and for the first time since the entity appeared, it was not moving away from the darkness. It was moving toward it. 3 standard cycles after his conversation with Commander Chun, Ambassador Varel found himself standing in the shuttle bay of the HMS Leviathan, watching as Thesan diplomats and crew members filed aboard the massive human vessel. The joint mission to the outer reaches had been planned for over a year. A cooperative voyage that would take representatives from 4 different species to the edge of known space where new territories awaited exploration and new resources awaited discovery. The convoy consisted of 4 Thesan cruisers with their beautiful silver hulls and graceful designs, 2 Vethkai science vessels bristling with sensors and research equipment, and the single human dreadnought that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Viral had not planned to travel aboard the human ship, but a last-minute change in arrangements had placed him on the Leviathan as a gesture of interspecies cooperation, and he had accepted the assignment with professional grace, even though he would have preferred the comfort of a Thesan vessel. The interior of the Leviathan was nothing like what Viral had expected. He had imagined something primitive and rough. Metal corridors with exposed pipes and flickering lights like the human vessels he had seen in entertainment broadcasts. But instead he found himself walking through clean and efficient hallways that hummed with quiet power. Everything on the ship seemed to have a purpose. Every panel and every door and every light fixture placed exactly where it needed to be for maximum function. And there was no wasted space anywhere that Viral could see. The human crew moved through these corridors with an urgency that the Thesan found almost exhausting to watch. Always walking quickly, always checking instruments, always speaking into communication devices about systems and readiness and preparation. Captain Marcus Webb met Viral on the command deck, and the human commander was a weathered man with gray hair at his temples and lines on his face that spoke of many years spent carrying heavy responsibilities. But it was his eyes that struck Viral most strongly, dark eyes that seemed to hold shadows in their depths, eyes that had seen things Viral could not imagine and probably did not want to. "Welcome aboard the Leviathan, Ambassador," Captain Webb said, and his voice was deep and steady like a rock that had weathered countless storms. "I hope you will find our accommodations acceptable for the journey." Viral performed the Thesan gesture of gratitude, touching 2 of his 4 hands together and bowing his head slightly. "I thank you for your hospitality, Captain," he replied, "though I admit I find your vessel somewhat different from what I expected." Webb's weathered face shifted into what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell with humans sometimes. "Different how?" he asked. Viral considered his words carefully before speaking, not wanting to give offense to his host. "Your ship seems excessive," he said finally, gesturing at the thick walls and the multiple redundant systems he could see throughout the command deck. "Every system appears to have 2 or 3 backup systems, and your hull armor is thicker than anything I have ever seen on a diplomatic vessel." He turned to face Captain Webb directly, his 4 eyes meeting the human's 2. "The Thesan build our ships for efficiency and elegance," he explained. We use exactly what we need and no more, because waste is illogical and excess is unnecessary. But this ship seems built to survive something terrible. Captain Webb was quiet for a long moment, and something flickered in those shadowed eyes that Viral could not read. The Leviathan was built to survive, Webb said simply, and his voice carried a weight that seemed heavier than the words themselves. That is her purpose and her promise. Survive what? Viral asked, and genuine curiosity filled his voice. The galaxy has been at peace for centuries, and the Thesan Collective maintains order across all known space. So what threat could possibly require such extreme preparation? Webb turned to look out the main viewport, where the stars stretched endlessly into the darkness, and his jaw tightened in a way that Viral had learned to recognize as a sign of tension in humans. The galaxy, you know, has been at peace, Ambassador, Webb said quietly. And there was something in his voice that made Viral's throat sacs pulse with unease. But there are parts of the galaxy that your people have never explored. Regions that your ancient maps mark only with warnings. Spaces between the safe lanes where your ships have never traveled. Viral wanted to ask what Webb meant by those words, wanted to demand an explanation for the strange tone in the human's voice. But before he could speak, the ship's alarms began to scream. Red lights flashed across every surface, and the human crew exploded into motion around them, running to stations and calling out reports, and preparing for something that Viral could not understand. Contact, shouted a young officer at the sensor station, and her voice was tight with something that sounded like controlled fear. We have something on long-range sensors, bearing 037 Mark 12. Distance approximately 50,000 kilometers and closing. Captain Webb strode to the center of the command deck, and all trace of the polite host vanished from his bearing as he transformed into something harder and more dangerous. What is it? He demanded. Is it a ship or a natural phenomenon? The sensor officer stared at her screens, and her face went pale in a way that made Viral feel ice forming in his chest. I do not know, sir, she whispered. It is not reading like anything in our databases. Not like any ship or any asteroid or any stellar phenomenon I have ever seen. It is just a darkness moving toward us. And it is big, Captain. It is so very big. The main viewport shifted to show the approaching contact, and Viral felt his four hearts stop beating for a single terrible moment. It was not a ship. It was not an asteroid. It was a wound in space itself, a writhing absence that drank starlight and pulsed with impossible colors that hurt to look upon. And it was vast beyond anything Viral had ever seen. Vast beyond anything he had ever imagined could exist. The convoy had stumbled into something ancient, something that had been sleeping in the void between stars since before the Thesan had first looked up at the night sky. Something that was now awake. Something that was hungry. And as Viral stood frozen on the bridge of the HM's Leviathan, watching death itself come swimming through the darkness toward them, he finally understood why humans named their ships after monsters. He understood, but that understanding had come far too late to matter. The HM's Leviathan turned toward the entity, and Viral felt his grip tighten on the nearest support rail as the ship accelerated into what he was certain would be their final moments of existence. Every instinct in his 800-year-old body screamed at him to flee, to find an escape pod, to do anything other than charge directly toward the impossible darkness that had just consumed an entire fleet without effort. But there was nowhere to run, and the humans were not running, and all Viral could do was watch as his fate rushed toward him through the cold vacuum of space. Then something happened that made him forget his fear, forget his despair, forget everything except the impossible sight unfolding before his four eyes. The Leviathan began to change. Panels along the hull shifted and moved, sliding aside to reveal hidden compartments that had not appeared on any schematic Viral had ever seen. And from those compartments emerged weapons that made his throat sacs clench with shock. The ship that had seemed merely functional now revealed itself as something far more dangerous. A predator that had been wearing the disguise of a patrol vessel. A monster that had been hiding its true nature until something worthy of that nature appeared. Massive cannon barrels extended from the bow, each one larger than a Thyssen shuttlecraft. Missile pods opened along the flanks, revealing row after row of warheads that glowed with barely contained energy. The armor plates themselves seemed to thicken and reinforce, layers sliding over layers until the Leviathan looked like a creature made of solid metal and fury. And the reactor, the primitive human reactor that the Thyssen engineers had dismissed as barely adequate, began to output energy readings that should have been impossible according to every law of physics Varl knew. "What is this?" Varl whispered, and his voice was barely audible over the hum of power flowing through the ship. The tactical officer glanced at him for just a moment, and there was something like a smile on her young face. "This is what we really are," she said, and then she turned back to her console as Captain Webb began to give orders. "All batteries," Webb commanded, and his voice carried the weight of every human who had ever built a weapon and pointed it at the darkness. "Show this thing why it should have stayed asleep." The Leviathan opened fire. Varl had never seen weapons like these, had never imagined that such things could exist, had never dreamed that the primitive humans could have built something so devastatingly powerful. Beams of energy that burned with the light of captive stars sliced through the void toward the entity, carving glowing wounds in its impossible flesh. Missiles that left trails of exotic particles screamed across the gap between ship and monster, detonating against the darkness with explosions that lit up the entire sector. Kinetic rounds accelerated to significant fractions of light speed punched through the entity's mass, leaving holes that slowly filled with more writhing darkness. And then the humans activated something they called Helios Protocol, a weapon so devastating that its very existence had been nothing more than rumor in the intelligence files of every other species in the known galaxy. A beam of pure white light erupted from the bow of the Leviathan, so bright that the viewport automatically dimmed to protect the eyes of everyone on the bridge. And when that beam struck the entity, the monster did something that no one had ever expected. It screamed. Not just the psychic broadcast it had been emanating since it woke, but an actual scream of pain and surprise. A sound that somehow traveled through the vacuum and resonated in the bones of everyone who heard it. For the first time in eons, perhaps for the first time ever, the entity felt agony. It turned its full attention on the Leviathan, abandoning the debris fields that had once been Thyssen cruisers, and it attacked with all the fury of something ancient and powerful that had suddenly discovered it could be hurt. The ship shuddered as tendrils of darkness slammed against its hull, and Varl was thrown to the deck as the impact sent tremors through every part of the vessel. "Hull breach, Deck 7. Someone shouted. "Hull breach, Deck 12. Another voice called out. "Medical bay is gone. We have casualties throughout sections 8 through 14. The Leviathan kept firing. Another beam of white light carved through the entity, and another volley of missiles detonated against its mass, and the kinetic rounds kept punching through faster than the wounds could heal. The ship pushed forward, driving into the entity's mass like a blade seeking a heart, taking damage that would have destroyed any Thyssen vessel 10 times over and still refusing to stop. Varl pulled himself up from the deck and watched in amazement as a human crew member with a shattered arm continued to operate a manual loading system for one of the secondary batteries, feeding shells into the weapon with his one good hand while blood soaked through his uniform. He watched engineers seal themselves into burning compartments to keep critical systems online, knowing they would die but choosing to spend their last moments keeping the ship fighting. He watched Captain Webb stand unmoving at the center of the bridge as blood from a head wound ran down his face, giving orders in that steady voice while his ship tore itself apart around him. "Forward batteries, concentrate fire on the central mass." Webb commanded. "Navigation, bring us in closer. I want to be inside this thing's reach." "Sir, if we go any closer, the hull will not survive." The navigation officer protested. "The hull will survive long enough." Webb replied, "All power to forward weapons. I want everything we have aimed at whatever passes for this thing's heart." The Leviathan surged forward, and the entity wrapped its tendrils around the ship in an embrace that should have crushed it to nothing. But the human vessel did not crush, did not break, did not surrender even as its hull crumpled, and its compartments collapsed, and its crew died by the dozens. It just kept firing, kept fighting, kept screaming its defiance into the face of something that had never known defiance before. Viral finally understood what he was witnessing. These humans were not fighting to survive. They had known from the moment the battle began that survival was unlikely, that the odds were against them, that death was probably waiting at the end of this fight. They were fighting to win. They were fighting because that was what humans did when they faced the darkness. What they had always done, what they would always do no matter the cost. And as Leviathan fired another Helios beam directly into the entity's core, Viral felt something he had never expected to feel. Hope! 11 hours of fire and darkness, of screaming metal and dying crew members, of weapons that should have been impossible wielded against an enemy that should not have existed. When it finally ended, the entity was dead. Its corpse spread across 3 light minutes of space, a vast stain of exotic matter and impossible colors that would take scientists centuries to study and understand. And at the center of that spreading death floated the broken remains of the HM's Leviathan. The ship that had killed a god was barely recognizable anymore. Its hull torn open in 100 places, its weapons melted or destroyed. Its beautiful, terrible form reduced to a drifting wreck that bled atmosphere into the void. But it was still there. It had survived. Of the 600 crew members who had served aboard the Leviathan when the battle began, 137 remained alive, and many of those were wounded in ways that would leave scars for the rest of their lives. But they had won. Varl found Captain Webb in what remained of the Combat Information Center, surrounded by broken screens and sparking consoles, coordinating rescue operations for the Thiessen and Vethkai survivors who had been aboard the Leviathan. When the battle began, the human captain looked like he had aged a decade in those 11 hours. His face pale beneath the dried blood from his head wound, his shoulders bent with an exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than mere physical tiredness. But his hands were steady as he worked, and his voice was calm as he gave orders, and his eyes still held that strange light that Viral had seen when the battle first began. "Captain Webb," Viral said, and his voice was barely a whisper because his throat sacs had been damaged during the battle and speaking was painful. Webb looked up from his work, and something like recognition flickered across his tired face. "Ambassador Viral," he said, "I'm glad you survived. We lost a lot of good people today, both human and Thiessen." Viral moved closer, stepping carefully around debris and broken equipment, until he stood beside the human captain who had done the impossible. "How?" he asked, and it was the only word he could manage. Webb was quiet for a long moment, looking out through a crack in the hull at the stars that burned eternally in the darkness. And when he finally spoke, his voice was tired but certain. 12,000 years ago, Ambassador, your people looked up at the stars and saw beauty," he began. "You saw wonder and possibility and the promise of knowledge waiting to be discovered. And you built vessels of elegance to explore that beauty. And that is a precious thing that I do not mock or dismiss." He turned to face Viral, and his eyes met the ambassador's 4 eyes with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a weary man. But when humans first looked up at the night sky, We saw something different, Webb continued. We saw the dark. We saw all the spaces between the stars where anything might be hiding. We saw the infinite void that stretched forever in all directions, and we imagined every horror that might be waiting in that void for us. He gestured at the wounded ship around them, at the broken walls and shattered systems and blood-stained corridors. We wrote stories about monsters and demons and things from beyond the stars that devoured worlds, he said. We told tales of ancient evils that slept in the darkness and woke when foolish people ventured too far from the light. We created mythologies of terror and nightmare that taught our children to fear what they could not see. Viral listened in silence, feeling something shift in his understanding of this strange and violent species. Your people thought we were superstitious, Webb said. And there was no accusation in his voice, only a tired kind of truth. You thought our fears were primitive, and our caution was the product of an uncivilized mind that had not yet learned the true nature of the universe. He smiled, and it was a sad smile that held centuries of human history in its curve. But fear is a gift, Ambassador, he said quietly. Fear teaches you what you might have to fight. Fear prepares you for enemies you have not yet met. Fear makes you build weapons and defenses and ships that can survive things that should not exist. He pointed out at the stars, at the void where the entity had come from, at the darkness that still stretched infinitely in all directions. We name our vessels after monsters because we know monsters are real, Webb said. We have always known. From the very first night when our ancestors huddled around fires and listened to things moving in the darkness beyond the light. His voice grew stronger, and Viral heard in it the echo of every human who had ever faced the night and refused to look away. We build our ships to kill monsters because we have been preparing for this moment since we first learned to be afraid of the dark. Webb continued. Every nightmare, every legend, every terrifying story we told our children was training for the day when we would meet something like that entity and have to decide whether to run or fight. He met Viral's gaze one final time, and in his eyes Viral saw something he had never expected to see in a member of such a young and supposedly primitive species. Wisdom. Humans have had a long time to be afraid, Ambassador, Captain Webb said, and we have used that time well. Viral looked at this human, this fragile creature from a small world orbiting an unremarkable star, this member of a species that had only been traveling among the stars for a few centuries. For 12,000 years, the Thesan had believed themselves the guardians of galactic civilization, the wise elders who protected the younger species and maintained order across known space. But they had never looked into the true dark. They had mapped the safe lanes and cataloged the known dangers and built their beautiful ships to sail through a universe they thought they understood. The humans had done something different. They had stared into the abyss since the dawn of their consciousness. They had imagined every horror that might be waiting for them. And they had spent their entire existence building monsters of their own to send back against the darkness. The official Thesan report on the incident would be classified at the highest levels, but a version of the story would spread anyway, as such stories always do. And in that story, the alien races of the galaxy would learn a new piece of wisdom that they would never forget. When humans name something after a monster, they are not being poetic. They are making a promise. And when the darkness comes, as it always does, eventually, humanity will keep that promise. The Leviathan drifted among the stars, broken but unbowed, and somewhere in the void another ancient thing stirred in its sleep and dreamed of hunger. But the humans were watching now, and their ships bore the names of nightmares, and they were ready. They had always been ready. That was what it meant to be human.